The sound of splintering wood exploded through the quiet Philadelphia neighborhood at 2:17 a.m. on a frozen February night. Detective Marcus Webb's boot connected with the door for the third time, and this time, the frame gave way with a sickening crack that echoed off the brick row houses lining Carpenter Street. Behind Marcus stood 5 officers, weapons drawn, hearts pounding, adrenaline coursing through their veins as they prepared to execute what their sergeant had called a high-priority narcotics warrant. This was supposed to be the bust that made careers. This was supposed to be the kind of raid that earned commendations and promotions. This was supposed to be a good night. But as the door flew open and flashlight beams cut through the darkness of the modest living room, Marcus Webb felt something cold settle in his stomach. Something was wrong. He could feel it before he could see it. And then Officer Jennifer Cole's tactical light swept across the wall directly ahead of them, and Marcus's blood turned to ice. There, hanging on the wall like a declaration of war, was an FBI jacket. Not folded. Not hidden. Displayed proudly next to a framed commendation letter signed by the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation himself. The words, Special Agent Diane Morrison, were clearly visible on the frame. And standing in the doorway of the bedroom, wearing old college pajamas with her hands raised slowly above her head, was a black woman whose eyes burned with a fury that could melt steel. Marcus had seen a lot of expressions in his 10 years of police work. He had seen fear, guilt, confusion, and resignation. But he had never seen anything like the look on this woman's face. This wasn't the look of someone caught doing something wrong. This was the look of someone who had just watched intruders break into her home and was already calculating exactly how she was going to destroy them for it. Diane Morrison was 39 years old, and she had spent the last 15 years of her life serving her country as a special agent in the FBI's Cyber Crimes Division. She had infiltrated criminal organizations that spanned continents. She had testified against mob bosses who had threatened her life. She had spent months undercover in situations where one wrong word would have meant a bullet in her head. She had received commendations, awards, and recognition from the highest levels of federal law enforcement. But none of that mattered at 2:17 a.m. when 5 Philadelphia police officers stood in her living room with their weapons pointed at her chest. In that moment, Diane wasn't Special Agent Morrison with 15 years of decorated service. She wasn't the woman who had helped dismantle a human trafficking ring in 2019. She wasn't the agent who had personally briefed senators on cybersecurity threats. She was just a black woman in her pajamas with guns aimed at her face, and she knew with absolute certainty that one wrong move, one gesture that a nervous officer misinterpreted, could mean she would never see another sunrise. So she moved slowly. Deliberately. She kept her hands visible at all times. She announced every movement before she made it. She did exactly what she had trained countless others to do in high-stress situations, even though every fiber of her being wanted to scream at these intruders who had just destroyed her front door. Diane had grown up 6 blocks from this very house, raised by a single mother who worked double shifts as a nurse to keep food on the table and hope in their hearts. When her grandmother passed away 8 years ago and left Diane this row house, everyone had expected her to sell it. She was a federal agent now. She could afford something nicer in the suburbs, somewhere with a bigger yard and neighbors who didn't play music until midnight. But Diane had refused. This house was her connection to where she came from. Every morning when she woke up in the same bedroom where she had studied for her SATs, she remembered the girl she used to be and the woman she had fought to become. The black Dodge Charger in her driveway wasn't a drug dealer's flashy vehicle. It was a government-issued car assigned to her for official FBI business. The irregular hours she kept weren't signs of criminal activity. They were the reality of chasing cybercriminals who operated across time zones and never slept. The visitors who came to her house at night weren't drug customers. They were fellow agents dropping off classified materials that couldn't be transmitted electronically. Everything that had made her look suspicious on paper had a perfectly innocent explanation. But nobody had bothered to check. Nobody had bothered to ask. Nobody had bothered to do basic due diligence before kicking in her door in the middle of the night. Officer Jennifer Cole was the first to lower her weapon. The young officer's face flooded with shame as the reality of what they had just done began to sink in. The other officers exchanged glances, suddenly finding their boots extremely interesting. But Marcus Webb stood frozen, his mind racing through the implications of what he was seeing. The FBI jacket on the wall. The commendation from the director. The case files scattered across the coffee table, each one stamped with federal security classifications. This wasn't a drug dealer's home. This was a federal agent's residence. And he had just led a team of officers to kick down her door at 2 in the morning based on an anonymous tip. Diane reached slowly for her badge wallet on the coffee table, moving with exaggerated care so that no nervous officer would make a fatal mistake. She flipped it open, revealing the gold shield that represented everything she had worked for her entire adult life. Special Agent Diane Morrison, FBI Cyber Crimes Division, she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. And you just kicked in the door of a federal agent conducting an active investigation based on what I'm guessing is the flimsiest warrant I've ever seen in my 15 years of federal service. The words hung in the air like a death sentence for every career in that room. Marcus felt his entire professional life beginning to crumble around him. He thought about his pension, his reputation, the respect he had built over a decade of honest police work. All of it was dissolving in real time because he had trusted the wrong people. He had trusted the tip. He had trusted his sergeant. He had trusted Detective Linda Hayes, who had personally vouched for the source. But as he stood in Diane Morrison's living room, surrounded by evidence of his catastrophic mistake, Marcus noticed something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Diane wasn't just angry. Behind the fury in her eyes, there was something else. She was calculating. She was analyzing. And in the split second their eyes met, Marcus saw recognition flicker across her face. Not recognition of him personally, but recognition of something larger. Recognition of a pattern. Recognition of a truth that Marcus couldn't yet see but could somehow feel pressing down on him like a weight. Diane Morrison knew something. And whatever she knew, Marcus was absolutely certain he wasn't going to like it. The cold February wind blew through the shattered doorframe, but the chill Marcus felt had nothing to do with the weather. Something was very wrong here. Something much bigger than a botched raid. And standing in the wreckage of what was supposed to be his career-making bust, Marcus Webb had no idea that he was standing at the center of a conspiracy that stretched across 3 states and reached into the highest levels of law enforcement. He had no idea that the woman whose door he had just destroyed was about to become the most important ally he would ever have. And he had no idea that the people who had sent him here were counting on exactly this outcome. This wasn't a mistake. It was a trap. And Diane Morrison had just become the bait. 3 weeks before Detective Marcus Webb's boot connected with Diane Morrison's front door, Detective Linda Hayes sat in her personal vehicle outside a warehouse in South Philadelphia, waiting for a man who could destroy everything she had built. Linda was 45 years old, and she had spent 12 years climbing the ranks of the Philadelphia Police Department's Narcotics Division. On paper, she was a respected investigator with an impressive arrest record and a reputation for getting results. She had commendations in her file. She had junior detectives who looked up to her as a mentor. She had a salary that afforded her a comfortable life in a decent neighborhood. But Linda Hayes had expensive tastes and a gambling problem that had spiraled out of control 4 years ago. The salary wasn't enough. The commendations didn't pay for the private poker games where she had lost more money than she could ever repay on a detective's income. So when Miguel Ramirez had approached her 18 months ago with an offer that seemed too good to be true, Linda had listened. And then she had accepted. And then she had become something she never thought she would be, a dirty cop on a drug cartel's payroll. The passenger door of Linda's sedan opened, and Miguel Ramirez slid into the seat beside her. Miguel was 52 years old, silver-haired, and dressed in a suit that cost more than Linda's monthly mortgage payment. He looked like a successful businessman, which was technically true. The Ramirez organization operated a chain of legitimate car washes, laundromats, and check-cashing stores across the eastern seaboard. These businesses made money. They also made excellent vehicles for laundering the tens of millions of dollars that flowed through the organization's drug trafficking operations. Miguel had built his empire over 25 years, and he had survived this long by being smarter, more cautious, and more ruthless than his competitors. But tonight, Miguel Ramirez looked worried. And that worried Linda more than anything else could have. "We have a problem," Miguel said, his voice calm but his eyes betraying the tension underneath. "There's an FBI agent named Diane Morrison working out of the Philadelphia field office. Cyber Crimes Division. For the past 8 months, she's been tracking our money. Not the drugs. The money." Linda felt her stomach clench. She had known that federal attention was always a risk, but she had assumed that the cartel's sophisticated money laundering operation was too complex for anyone to trace. Apparently, she had assumed wrong. "How close is she?" Linda asked, keeping her voice steady through sheer force of will. Miguel turned to look at her, and the fear in his eyes was now unmistakable. "Her team is less than 2 weeks away from cracking our entire financial network. When that happens, they won't just find the money. They'll find every account we use to pay our people. Every wire transfer. Every connection." He paused, letting the weight of his next words sink in. "They'll find you, Linda. They'll find the 15 officers across 3 states who we've been paying for protection. They'll find Judge O'Brien. They'll find everyone. And when they do, we all go down together." Linda sat in silence for a long moment, her mind racing through the implications. 18 months of payments. $450,000 deposited into offshore accounts in her name. Text messages with Miguel that she had foolishly never deleted. If this FBI agent succeeded, Linda wouldn't just lose her career. She would spend the rest of her life in federal prison. She would lose everything she had worked for. She would be publicly humiliated, dragged through the media, held up as an example of corruption. The daughter of a retired police captain, following in her father's footsteps only to end up in handcuffs herself. The shame would kill her mother. The scandal would destroy her family name. No. That couldn't happen. That wouldn't happen. Linda had worked too hard and risked too much to let some FBI agent with a computer science degree bring it all crashing down. "Tell me everything you know about her," Linda said, her voice hardening into something cold and determined. Miguel pulled out a folder and handed it to her. Inside were surveillance photos of Diane Morrison, details about her career, her address, her vehicle, her schedule. Linda flipped through the pages, and then she stopped. Her eyes widened. Her lips curled into something that might have been a smile but was far too predatory to qualify. "I know her," Linda said softly. "We worked a joint task force together 2 years ago. Bank robbery investigation. I know where she lives. I know her schedule. I know she lives alone." Miguel studied her face, trying to read her intentions. "What are you thinking?" Linda closed the folder and set it on her lap. Her mind was already working through the possibilities, discarding options that were too risky, too obvious, too traceable. She needed something elegant. Something that would neutralize Diane Morrison without drawing attention to the real reason behind it. Something that would look like a mistake rather than a deliberate attack. And then it came to her. The perfect plan. The plan that would destroy Diane Morrison's credibility, taint her evidence, and create enough chaos to derail her investigation permanently. Linda would use the very system she had sworn to uphold as a weapon. She would turn Diane Morrison from an investigator into a suspect. She would make it look like the FBI agent was the criminal, and by the time anyone figured out the truth, it would be too late. The investigation would be compromised. The evidence would be questioned. And Linda Hayes would walk away clean while Diane Morrison's career burned to ashes. "I'm thinking," Linda said slowly, savoring each word, "that Special Agent Morrison is about to have a very bad night. And when I'm done with her, no one will believe a word she says about anything." She turned to look at Miguel, and the coldness in her eyes made even the drug lord shift uncomfortably in his seat. "I'm going to need you to provide some financial documentation. Fake deposits into accounts that look like they belong to her. Can your people do that?" Miguel nodded slowly. "Consider it done. What else?" Linda pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the name she was looking for. Patricia O'Brien. Her husband's sister. A federal judge who owed Linda more favors than she could count and who had her own reasons for wanting to stay in Linda's good graces. "Leave the rest to me," Linda said. "Within 3 weeks, Diane Morrison won't just be off your case. She'll be fighting for her freedom. And her evidence? It'll be worthless. Every file she's compiled, every connection she's traced, every witness she's cultivated. All of it will be questioned because the lead investigator will be under investigation herself." Linda drafted the anonymous tip that night, sitting in her home office with a glass of whiskey and a sense of dark satisfaction. She made it specific enough to seem credible but vague enough to avoid obvious red flags. Black female, late 30s, drives a black Dodge Charger, keeps irregular hours, receives multiple visitors at night, and has been seen accepting packages from known dealers. Every detail was technically true if you stripped it of context. Every detail pointed directly at Diane Morrison's address. And every detail was designed to trigger exactly the response Linda needed. The next morning, she fed the tip through the department's narcotics hotline using a burner phone she would destroy immediately afterward. Then she waited for someone to pick it up. When Detective Marcus Webb's team was assigned to investigate, Linda made sure to insert herself into the process. She vouched for the anonymous source personally, lending her 12 years of credibility to the fabricated tip. She emphasized the urgency, the potential scope of the operation, the career-making potential of a major fentanyl bust. Marcus Webb was a good cop. Linda knew that. He was honest, dedicated, and thorough. Under normal circumstances, he would have dug deeper into the tip, would have done more surveillance, would have verified the information before requesting a warrant. But Linda didn't give him that chance. She created a sense of momentum that swept Marcus and his team along before they could stop to think. She arranged for the warrant request to land on Judge Patricia O'Brien's desk. Patricia signed it within hours, rubber-stamping the raid with barely a glance at the supporting documentation. Everything was moving exactly according to plan. And through it all, Linda maintained her mask of professional concern, playing the role of the experienced detective helping younger colleagues make a major bust. The night before the raid, Linda sat in her living room and allowed herself to imagine the aftermath. Diane Morrison, confused and humiliated, dragged from her home in handcuffs while neighbors watched. FBI Internal Affairs launching an investigation into their own agent. The Ramirez money laundering case grinding to a halt as prosecutors questioned whether any of Morrison's evidence could be trusted. Linda Hayes, meanwhile, would express appropriate shock and disappointment that a tip she had vouched for turned out to be connected to a federal agent. She would claim she had no idea. She would be the victim of bad information, not the architect of a deliberate attack. It was perfect. It was untraceable. It was exactly the kind of operation that had kept Linda one step ahead of accountability for 18 months. But Linda Hayes made a mistake that arrogant people always make. She underestimated her target. She looked at Diane Morrison's address in a working-class neighborhood and saw someone without resources. She looked at Diane's quiet, dedicated career and saw someone without powerful allies. She looked at a black woman who had worked twice as hard for half the recognition and saw someone who would crumble under pressure. She assumed that Diane Morrison would react the way Linda expected her to react. She assumed that the system would work the way Linda had manipulated it to work. She assumed that when the raid happened, Diane would be too shocked, too traumatized, and too busy defending herself to figure out what had really happened. Linda was wrong about all of it. The morning after the raid, the plan seemed to be working perfectly. Diane Morrison had been subjected to a humiliating search of her home. News of the incident was spreading through law enforcement channels like wildfire. An FBI agent raided by local police on drug suspicions. Even though no drugs were found, the damage was done. Questions were being asked. Diane's supervisor had placed her on administrative leave pending an internal review. Her case files on the Ramirez investigation had been seized as potential evidence of her alleged corruption. Everything Linda had intended was coming to pass. Within 48 hours, Diane Morrison went from being one of the FBI's most respected cybercrimes investigators to being a pariah in her own agency. Colleagues who had trusted her for 15 years suddenly found reasons to avoid her in the hallways. Conversations stopped when she walked into rooms. The whisper campaign was even more effective than Linda had anticipated. Someone in the department leaked details about the raid to a contact at a local news station. The headline that ran that evening was carefully worded to avoid outright accusations while still destroying Diane's reputation through implication. FBI agents home raided in drug investigation, questions raised about unexplained wealth. The story mentioned Diane's row house in a working-class neighborhood, implying that it was somehow suspicious for a federal agent to live modestly. It mentioned her government vehicle, twisting the black Dodge Charger into evidence of a lavish lifestyle. It mentioned the late-night visitors, the packages, the irregular hours. All the details Linda had planted in her anonymous tip were now being broadcast to the entire city as grounds for suspicion. Diane's mother called her that night, voice trembling with confusion and fear. "Baby, Mrs. Johnson from church showed me something on her phone. It says you're in trouble with drugs." I told her it was lies, Diane. I told her my daughter would never do something like that. It is lies, isn't it, baby? And for the first time in 15 years of facing down criminals who would have happily killed her, for the first time since she had held a dying informant in her arms and promised him his sacrifice wouldn't be in vain, for the first time since she had walked into a room full of human traffickers wearing nothing but a wire and her courage, Diane Morrison broke down and cried. Not because she was afraid. Not because she doubted herself. But because her mother's voice held a question that should never have needed to be asked. Because the system she had dedicated her life to serving was being weaponized against her. Because somewhere out there, someone had done this to her deliberately, and she didn't yet know who or why. The next day, Diane tried to retrieve her personal belongings from FBI headquarters. She was escorted through the building by security guards, like a criminal being processed rather than an agent who had served with distinction for 15 years. Young agents she had mentored looked away as she passed. Supervisors who had praised her work suddenly couldn't meet her eyes. Her badge was taken, temporarily, pending the investigation's outcome. Her access credentials were revoked. She was told to remain available for questioning but not to contact any of her former colleagues or attempt to access any case materials. She was being isolated, cut off from any resources that might help her understand what had happened or prove her innocence. And Linda Hayes, watching from a safe distance, smiled with satisfaction. The trap had closed perfectly. But something unexpected was happening that Linda hadn't accounted for. Detective Marcus Webb, the man who had led the raid, was supposed to be focused entirely on saving his own career. He was facing disciplinary hearings for executing a warrant that had violated a federal agent's civil rights. His future in the department was hanging by a thread. By all logic, he should have been too busy protecting himself to worry about anything else. But Marcus couldn't stop thinking about that night. He couldn't stop seeing Diane Morrison's eyes in the moment their gazes had locked across her ransacked living room. He had expected to see fear, or guilt, or the desperate calculation of someone caught in a crime. Instead, he had seen fury. Righteous, burning fury. The fury of someone who had been wronged and was already planning their counterattack. Marcus replayed the raid in his mind again and again. He analyzed every detail of the anonymous tip that had led them there. He thought about how quickly the warrant had been approved, how insistently Linda Hayes had vouched for the source, how perfectly everything had seemed to line up. In 10 years of police work, Marcus had learned to trust his instincts. And his instincts were screaming that something about this entire situation was deeply, fundamentally wrong. The tip had been too specific. The warrant had been too easy. Linda's involvement had been too eager. And the target, rather than being a drug dealer caught off guard, had been a federal agent with an impeccable record. None of it made sense. Unless the raid had never been about drugs at all. Unless Diane Morrison had been targeted for an entirely different reason. Unless Marcus and his team had been used as weapons in a war they didn't even know was being fought. Marcus started digging quietly into the background of the case. He pulled the original tip recording and listened to it a dozen times, noting the careful phrasing, the specific details that matched Diane's life perfectly, the complete lack of information about any actual drug activity. He researched Diane Morrison's career and found nothing but commendations and successful investigations. He looked into the timing of the raid and discovered that it had been executed less than 2 weeks before Diane's cybercrimes unit was scheduled to present major findings in a money laundering investigation. The coincidence was too perfect to be coincidental. But Marcus knew he couldn't act on suspicions alone. He needed proof. He needed someone who understood what was really happening. He needed help from the last person he expected to offer it, the woman whose door he had kicked in. Linda Hayes had spent 18 months believing she was untouchable. She had money, power, connections, and a badge that she thought made her immune to consequences. But she had made one fatal error. She had underestimated a woman she tried to destroy. And now the truth was about to start moving. Slowly at first. Then faster. Then unstoppable. Marcus Webb sat in the waiting area outside Lieutenant Raymond Foster's office, staring at the wall and trying to prepare himself for what was coming. The disciplinary hearing was scheduled to begin in 20 minutes, and Marcus had no illusions about how it would go. He had led a raid that violated the civil rights of a federal agent. He had executed a warrant based on information that turned out to be completely fabricated. He had pointed his weapon at a woman who had dedicated her life to serving the same justice system he was supposed to protect. There was no version of this hearing that ended with Marcus keeping his badge. The best he could hope for was avoiding criminal charges. The worst was prison time for civil rights violations. His career was over. His reputation was destroyed. His pension was gone. Everything he had worked for over 10 years was about to disappear because he had trusted the wrong people. And the worst part was that Marcus still didn't fully understand how it had happened. He had followed procedure. He had trusted his colleagues. He had done everything by the book. And somehow, the book itself had been weaponized against him. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Marcus pulled it out and looked at the screen. Unknown number. Normally, he would have ignored it. But something made him open the message. The words on the screen made his heart stop. Detective Webb, this is S.A. Morrison. Don't say anything in that meeting. Trust me. I'll explain everything at Rose's Cafe on Market Street, noon. Come alone. Marcus read the message 3 times, certain he was misunderstanding something. Why would Diane Morrison, the woman whose life he had helped destroy, want to meet with him? Why would she tell him to stay silent in his disciplinary hearing? Why would she offer to explain anything when she should be focused on rebuilding her own shattered career? None of it made sense. And yet, something in Marcus's gut told him to listen. The same instinct that had been screaming at him for days, telling him that the raid was wrong, that the tip was fabricated, that he had been used as a pawn in a game he didn't understand. Maybe Diane Morrison had the answers he needed. Maybe she knew something that could explain how everything had gone so catastrophically wrong. Or maybe this was a trap, and Marcus was about to walk into something that would make his situation even worse. But what did he have to lose at this point? His career was already over. His future was already destroyed. If there was even a chance that Diane could help him understand what had happened, Marcus had to take it. He sat through the disciplinary hearing in silence, exactly as Diane had instructed. Lieutenant Foster asked questions. Internal Affairs representatives demanded explanations. Marcus gave one-word answers when he absolutely had to speak and said nothing else. His union representative kept shooting him confused looks, clearly expecting Marcus to mount some kind of defense. But Marcus stayed quiet, watching the clock, waiting for noon. When the hearing was finally suspended for the day, Marcus slipped out of the precinct through a side exit and made his way to Rose's Cafe on Market Street. The lunch crowd was just starting to fill the small restaurant when Marcus arrived. He scanned the room and spotted Diane Morrison in a back booth, 2 cups of coffee already on the table in front of her. She looked different from the woman he had seen that night in her pajamas. She was dressed professionally now, her posture straight and confident, her eyes sharp and calculating. This was Special Agent Morrison, not the terrified victim he had expected to find. This was a woman who had spent 15 years in the FBI and had faced down far worse threats than a botched raid by local police. Marcus walked to the booth and sat down across from her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Diane studied his face with an intensity that made Marcus feel like she was reading every thought in his head. Finally, she broke the silence. "You look terrible, Detective Webb." Marcus almost laughed. "Yeah, well, having your career destroyed tends to have that effect." Diane nodded slowly, as if this was exactly the answer she had expected. "Before we go any further, I need to know something. The night of the raid, when you kicked in my door, did you have any idea who I was? Did you know you were targeting a federal agent?" Marcus shook his head. "No. I had no idea. The tip said you were a drug dealer. The warrant was signed by a judge. My sergeant said it was a high-priority operation. I trusted the information I was given. I didn't know any of it was false until I saw your FBI jacket on the wall." Diane watched his face carefully as he spoke, looking for any sign of deception. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded again and reached for something beside her on the booth seat. She pulled out a thin manila folder and slid it across the table toward Marcus. "That warrant was a setup, Detective Webb. And I know exactly who set us both up." Marcus opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were surveillance photographs showing Detective Linda Hayes meeting with a silver-haired man in expensive suits. Wire transfer records showing hundreds of thousands of dollars deposited into offshore accounts. Text message transcripts between Linda and someone identified as Judge P. O'Brien. A timeline connecting dates and events in a pattern that made Marcus's blood run cold. He looked up at Diane, unable to fully process what he was seeing. "Linda Hayes has been on the payroll of the Ramirez drug organization for at least 18 months, Diane explained, her voice low and controlled. "The Ramirez family runs one of the largest money laundering operations on the East Coast. My cyber crimes unit has been investigating their financial network for the past 8 months. We were less than 2 weeks away from cracking their entire system when your raid happened. That wasn't a coincidence, Detective. Linda Hayes knew about my investigation. She knew that when we finished our work, we would expose not just the Ramirez organization, but every corrupt law enforcement officer they've been paying for protection. 15 officers across 3 states. Evidence clerks, patrol cops, detectives, and at least 1 federal judge. All of them on the cartel's payroll. All of them about to be exposed by my investigation." Marcus felt like the ground was shifting beneath his feet. Linda Hayes had been his mentor. She had vouched for the anonymous tip that led to the raid. She had personally encouraged him to pursue the warrant aggressively. She had been there every step of the way, guiding the operation, building the case, pushing for quick action. And the whole time, she had been using him as a weapon to destroy a federal investigation that threatened to expose her crimes. "The anonymous tip," Marcus said slowly, the pieces finally clicking into place. "Linda created it. She fed it through the hotline herself. She made it specific enough to point directly at you." Diane nodded. "Linda and I worked a joint task force together 2 years ago. She knew my address, my schedule, my vehicle. She knew I lived alone. She knew exactly how to make the tip sound credible because she had all the details she needed to make it match my life. The irregular hours, the government car, the late-night visitors. All of it was true in the most twisted way possible. She just stripped away the context that would have explained everything." Marcus flipped to the next page in the folder and stopped. He was looking at a photograph of Judge Patricia O'Brien standing next to Linda Hayes at what appeared to be a family gathering. "Judge O'Brien is Linda's sister-in-law," Diane said. "She married Linda's brother 15 years ago. When Linda needed a judge who would rubber stamp a warrant without asking too many questions, she went to family. Patricia signed off on your raid in record time because Linda told her exactly what was at stake. If my investigation succeeded, Patricia O'Brien would be exposed along with everyone else. She had just as much reason to want me destroyed as Linda did." Marcus sat back in the booth, his mind reeling. He had thought he understood corruption. He had thought he knew how dirty cops operated. But this was something else entirely. This was a conspiracy that stretched across multiple agencies, multiple states, multiple levels of the justice system. And he had walked right into the middle of it, completely blind to what was happening around him. "So why are you telling me this?" Marcus asked. Why not just take this evidence to your people and let Linda burn? Why do you need me? Diane leaned forward, her eyes fierce with an intensity that made Marcus understand why she had survived 15 years in the FBI. Because Linda Hayes didn't just corrupt herself, detective. She corrupted the system around her. She has allies in places I can't reach with federal authority alone. Judges, prosecutors, evidence clerks. If I go in alone, they'll find a way to bury this. They'll claim my evidence is tainted because I'm the subject of an investigation myself. They'll argue that I fabricated everything to save my own career. They'll use every procedural trick in the book to protect themselves. But if I have someone on the inside, someone who was used just like me, someone who can testify that they were fed false information by a corrupt detective, then everything changes. Your testimony corroborates my evidence. Your experience proves that Linda was running an operation against me. Together, we don't just take down Linda Hayes. We take down everyone. Every dirty cop. Every corrupt judge. Every cartel connection. All of it. Marcus understood what she was asking. She wanted him to become an informant against his own colleagues. She wanted him to wear a wire, gather evidence, and help build a case that would destroy careers and send people to prison. It was dangerous. It was risky. It could get him killed if the wrong people found out what he was doing. But as Marcus sat there looking at the evidence in front of him, he realized he didn't really have a choice. Linda Hayes had already destroyed his career. She had used him as a weapon against an innocent woman. She had corrupted the badge that Marcus had sworn to honor for 10 years. And she was still out there, still protected, still confident that she had gotten away with everything. That couldn't stand. Marcus had become a cop because he believed in justice. He had dedicated his life to protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. And now, for the first time in his career, he understood what it meant to be on the other side. He understood what it felt like to be victimized by the very system that was supposed to protect him. He understood why people lost faith in law enforcement, why communities didn't trust the police, why the badge sometimes meant oppression instead of protection. What do you need me to do? Marcus asked. Diane allowed herself a small smile, the first sign of warmth she had shown since Marcus sat down. I need you to go back to the precinct and act like nothing has changed. Attend your disciplinary hearings. Act defeated, broken, ready to accept whatever punishment comes your way. Meanwhile, you'll be wearing a wire. I need you to get close to Linda Hayes. Express doubt about the raid. See if she says anything incriminating. She's arrogant. She thinks she's won. People like that always slip up eventually. All we need is one good recording, one clear admission, and the whole thing comes crashing down. Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus did exactly as Diane instructed. He returned to the precinct with his head down and his shoulders slumped, playing the role of a broken man whose career was ending in disgrace. He endured the pitying looks from colleagues and the cold shoulders from supervisors. He sat through disciplinary hearings and said nothing in his own defense. And every day, he wore a wire hidden beneath his shirt, recording every conversation, documenting every interaction. Linda Hayes approached him on the third day, her face arranged in an expression of sympathy that Marcus now recognized as completely fake. Marcus, I heard about your hearing. I'm so sorry this happened to you. But remember what I always say. Know your place, play the game, and things work out. Maybe this Morrison situation will just go away. These things have a way of working themselves out. Marcus forced himself to nod, to look grateful for her concern, even as the wire captured every word. Yeah, Linda. I'm starting to understand exactly how things work around here. Linda patted his shoulder and walked away, completely unaware that she had just taken the first step toward her own destruction. Over the following days, Linda grew more comfortable around Marcus. She saw him as a fellow victim of circumstances, someone who had been caught up in a situation beyond his control. She started making comments about handling the Morrison situation, about judges who were more cooperative than others, about how some problems just needed the right approach to disappear. Each conversation was recorded. Each slip of the tongue was documented. And with every passing day, the case against Linda Hayes grew stronger. The breakthrough came on the 12th night, when Linda invited Marcus to a celebratory dinner at an upscale restaurant downtown. She was in a good mood, confident that the worst was behind her. She ordered expensive wine and talked about her plans for the future. And as the alcohol loosened her tongue, she started talking about her retirement plans in ways that made the wire recording worth its weight in gold. You know, Marcus, there are people in this city who pay very well for certain considerations. Consulting work, you might call it. And after the Morrison thing? My value just went up. Nobody threatens my clients and gets away with it. The confession was complete. The trap was set. Linda Hayes had spent 18 months building an empire of corruption. She had bribed judges, manipulated colleagues, and served a drug cartel while wearing a badge that was supposed to mean justice. But she had made one fatal mistake. She had underestimated the woman she tried to destroy. And now, Diane Morrison was coming for everything. The morning of March 15 dawned cold and gray over Philadelphia, with thick clouds hanging low over the city like a warning of storms to come. But for Diane Morrison, this was the day she had been waiting for since the moment those officers had kicked in her door. She stood in front of her bathroom mirror, adjusting the collar of her crisp navy suit, making sure her credentials hung straight around her neck. For 3 weeks, she had endured humiliation. For 3 weeks, she had been treated like a criminal by the very agency she had served with distinction for 15 years. For 3 weeks, she had played the role of the defeated victim while quietly building the case that would bring down everyone who had conspired against her. That role was over now. Today, Special Agent Diane Morrison was going to war. She arrived at FBI headquarters at 7 o'clock, flanked by agents from the Bureau's Internal Affairs Division and representatives from the Department of Justice. Her supervisor, Assistant Director Michael Torres, met her at the entrance with an expression that mixed professional respect with personal regret. "Agent Morrison, before we proceed, I want to personally apologize for what you've been put through. The evidence you've compiled is extraordinary. We should have trusted you from the beginning." Diane shook his hand firmly but didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Apologies can wait, sir. Right now, we have arrests to make." Torres nodded and handed her a tactical radio. "All teams are in position across 3 states. Philadelphia, Newark, Baltimore, and Wilmington are ready to move simultaneously. We're waiting for your signal." Diane took the radio and allowed herself one moment to savor what was about to happen. 15 corrupt officers. 1 federal judge. An entire drug cartel's financial network. All of them about to learn that the woman they had tried to destroy was the one who would deliver their destruction. She keyed the radio and spoke clearly. "All units, this is Special Agent Morrison. Execute, execute, execute." In a quiet residential neighborhood in Philadelphia's Main Line district, Judge Patricia O'Brien was enjoying her morning coffee when her doorbell rang. She wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment, she considered ignoring it. But the bell rang again, more insistent this time, and Patricia sighed and set down her cup. She shuffled to the front door in her bathrobe, annoyed at the early intrusion, and pulled it open to find 6 FBI agents standing on her doorstep with their badges displayed and their expressions grim. Patricia's coffee cup slipped from her fingers and shattered on the marble floor of her foyer, sending brown liquid splashing across her designer slippers. "Patricia O'Brien," the lead agent said, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to obstruct justice, falsification of judicial documents, and corruption of public office. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Patricia's face went through a rapid series of expressions. Confusion, disbelief, terror, and finally a desperate grasping for the power she thought she still held. "This is a mistake. Do you have any idea who I am? Do you have any idea who my friends are? I'm a federal judge. You can't just arrest me like some common criminal." The lead agent's expression didn't change. "Yes, ma'am. We know exactly who you are. That's why we're here. Please turn around and place your hands behind your back." As the handcuffs clicked shut around Patricia O'Brien's wrists, her neighbors began emerging from their homes to watch. Camera phones appeared. The quiet, respectable neighborhood witnessed one of its most prominent residents being led away in restraints, her bathrobe flapping in the cold morning wind, her carefully constructed life collapsing around her. Across the city and beyond, similar scenes were playing out simultaneously. In Newark, Detective James Morrison was sitting at his desk reviewing case files when 4 agents walked into his squad room. His colleagues watched in stunned silence as the man they had worked beside for 8 years was handcuffed and read his rights in front of everyone. In Baltimore, Sergeant William Chen was pulled from a morning briefing, his protests echoing through the halls as he was escorted out in restraints. In Wilmington, Captain Robert Hale was dragged from a staff meeting, his face a mask of shock and fury as the career he had built over 2 decades ended in public humiliation. Evidence clerks, prosecutors, patrol officers, detectives. One by one, the network of corruption that Linda Hayes had helped maintain was dismantled in a coordinated operation that would become the largest law enforcement corruption bust in the region's history. The Ramirez organization's legitimate businesses were raided at the same time. FBI agents swarmed car washes, laundromats, and check-cashing stores across the eastern seaboard, seizing computers, freezing bank accounts, and arresting anyone connected to the money laundering operation. Accountants who had cooked the books for years found themselves in handcuffs. Managers who had looked the other way found themselves facing federal charges. And Miguel Ramirez himself was arrested at his daughter's private school, pulled from the audience of a fifth-grade play and led away in front of horrified parents and crying children. The empire he had spent 25 years building was destroyed in a single morning, brought down by the federal agent he had tried to silence. The media descended on the story like wolves on wounded prey. Breaking news alerts interrupted regular programming across every major network. Headlines screamed about corruption, betrayal, and the shocking scope of the conspiracy. Massive multi-state corruption bust nets 15 officers, federal judge. FBI agents raid leads to largest police corruption case in decade. The woman they tried to destroy just destroyed them. Diane Morrison's face appeared on every screen, no longer the subject of suspicion but the hero of the hour. The same news outlets that had implied she was corrupt just weeks ago were now breathlessly reporting on her courage and determination. The narrative had flipped completely, and the people who had tried to bury her were now the ones being buried. But there was still one arrest left to make. The most important one. The one Diane had been saving for herself. Linda Hayes arrived at the Philadelphia Police Department precinct at 9 o'clock, unaware that anything unusual was happening. She had slept well the night before, confident that her plans were proceeding perfectly. The Morrison situation was contained. The disciplinary hearings were grinding Marcus Webb into dust. Miguel Ramirez's payments were still flowing into her offshore accounts. Everything was fine. Everything was under control. She walked through the lobby, nodding to colleagues, greeting subordinates, playing the role of the respected veteran detective she had pretended to be for 12 years. She didn't notice the unusual tension in the air. She didn't see the way her colleagues avoided eye contact or the nervous whispers that followed her progress through the building. She was too confident, too certain of her own invincibility, to recognize the signs of her impending doom. She was pouring her second cup of coffee in the break room when the bullpen suddenly went silent. Linda looked up, annoyed at the interruption, and froze. Diane Morrison was walking through the front entrance of the precinct, flanked by FBI agents in tactical gear. She was dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, her credentials displayed prominently around her neck, her posture radiating authority and purpose. Behind her came more agents, spreading out through the bullpen, taking positions at every exit. The message was clear. No one was leaving until this was done. Linda's coffee cup slipped from her fingers, shattering on the floor just as Patricia O'Brien's had done hours earlier. The brown liquid spread across the linoleum, but Linda didn't notice. Her eyes were fixed on Diane Morrison, who was walking directly toward her with the steady, measured pace of someone who had waited a very long time for this moment. The entire precinct watched in silence as Diane approached Linda's position. Officers who had whispered about Diane Morrison, who had believed the lies, who had looked away when she was escorted out like a criminal, now stood motionless as the truth revealed itself. Linda tried to speak, but her voice came out as a croak. "Diane. I can explain. This isn't what it looks like." Diane stopped directly in front of Linda, close enough that only the two of them could hear her next words. "Actually, Linda, it's exactly what it looks like. We have the wire transfers. We have the surveillance photos. We have the text messages with Judge O'Brien. We have Detective Webb's testimony and recordings of you confessing to crimes while you thought no one was listening. We have everything." Linda's face went pale. Her carefully constructed world was collapsing around her, and for the first time since she had started taking cartel money 18 months ago, she felt the cold grip of genuine fear. "Linda Hayes," Diane said, her voice now loud enough for everyone in the precinct to hear, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit corruption of public officials, obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, conspiracy to commit fraud, and serving as an agent of a criminal enterprise. You have the right to remain silent." Linda's composure shattered completely. "No, no, no. This isn't right. You don't understand. I run this town. I have connections you can't touch. No one will believe you. No one will believe anything you say. You're just trying to save yourself. You're the criminal here, not me." The desperation in her voice echoed through the silent bullpen. Officers who had respected Linda for 12 years watched as the mask finally fell away, revealing the corruption that had been hiding underneath all along. Diane stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried through the entire room. "Actually, Linda, everyone believes me. Especially the 15 officers we arrested this morning who are all trying to cut deals by testifying against you. Judge O'Brien is already talking to prosecutors. Miguel Ramirez is giving up everyone who ever took $1 from his organization. You're not the one with connections anymore. You're the one everyone is connecting to their crimes." Linda began to shake, her body trembling with fear and disbelief. Diane leaned in even closer, her eyes boring into Linda's with an intensity that made the corrupt detective flinch backward. "And that thing you used to say, Linda. What was it? Know your place? Play the game? Well, Linda. Now you know your place. It's in a federal prison cell for the next 3 decades. The handcuffs clicked shut around Linda Hayes's wrists with a sound that echoed through the silent precinct like a gunshot. 2 FBI agents took her by the arms and began leading her toward the exit, past the colleagues she had worked with for 12 years, past the officers she had mentored and manipulated, past the system she had corrupted from within. Linda was crying now, tears streaming down her face, her carefully applied makeup running in dark streaks. She tried to hide her face, but there was nowhere to hide. Everyone was watching. Everyone saw her shame. The woman who had said know your place was finally learning her own. Outside the precinct, the scene was chaotic. News crews had arrived, their cameras capturing every moment of Linda Hayes's perp walk. Reporters shouted questions that Linda couldn't answer. Photographers snapped pictures that would appear on front pages across the country. The crowd of onlookers grew larger by the minute, drawn by the spectacle of a veteran detective being led away in handcuffs. Linda Hayes, who had spent 18 months believing she was untouchable, was now the most visible example of corruption in the city's history. Her face would be synonymous with betrayal for years to come. Her name would be used as a cautionary tale in police academies and ethics seminars. Her fall from grace would be studied and analyzed and picked apart by journalists and academics and reformers looking for lessons in how systems fail. 3 months later, the trials began. Linda Hayes sat at the defense table in a federal courtroom, looking like a shadow of the confident woman she had once been. Her expensive suits had been replaced by prison orange. Her perfectly styled hair had grown out into a dull gray. The arrogance that had defined her for 18 months had been replaced by a hollow desperation that made even her own attorneys uncomfortable. Across the courtroom gallery sat Officer Jennifer Cole, who had been on the raid team and was now a prosecution witness. Marcus Webb took the stand and played the wire recordings for the jury, including Linda's drunken confession about consulting work and clients who paid well for certain considerations. The "Know Your Place" comment played on the courtroom speakers, and Linda flinched as if she had been struck. The prosecution's closing argument was devastating. Linda Hayes didn't just betray her badge. She betrayed every officer who works honestly. She betrayed every citizen who trusted the system. She betrayed the very concept of justice. And when she tried to destroy Special Agent Diane Morrison, a woman who had dedicated her life to serving this country, she made the worst decision of her entire criminal career. Because Diane Morrison didn't break. Diane Morrison didn't surrender. Diane Morrison brought the truth. And the truth is what brings us here today. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning their verdict. Guilty on all counts. Linda Hayes collapsed in her chair, sobbing uncontrollably as the reality of her fate finally sank in. The judge scheduled sentencing for the following month, and when that day came, the courtroom was packed with spectators eager to witness the final chapter of Linda Hayes's destruction. Linda Hayes, the judge intoned, his voice heavy with disgust, this court sentences you to 27 years in federal prison. You will serve a minimum of 23 years before becoming eligible for parole. All assets acquired through your criminal activities will be seized by the government. Your pension is revoked. Your name will be removed from all departmental honors and commendations. You are hereby barred from ever holding public office or law enforcement position for the remainder of your life. Linda's wail of anguish filled the courtroom as bailiffs led her away in chains. The other defendants received similar fates. Judge Patricia O'Brien got 15 years and was permanently disbarred. The 15 corrupt officers received combined sentences totaling over 200 years. Miguel Ramirez and his top lieutenants were sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. $47 million in cartel assets were seized by the federal government. Diane Morrison's restoration was complete and public. The FBI issued a formal apology and reinstated her with full honors. The Philadelphia Police Department held a press conference acknowledging the injustice she had suffered and announcing sweeping reforms to prevent similar abuses in the future. The Attorney General of the United States personally presented Diane with a commendation for exceptional courage in exposing systemic corruption. Marcus Webb was cleared of all disciplinary charges and promoted to lead a new internal affairs division focused on rooting out corruption within the department. The young detective who had kicked in Diane's door had become an ally in the fight for justice, his testimony crucial to bringing down the conspiracy that had tried to use him as a weapon. On the evening after Linda Hayes' sentencing, Diane Morrison returned to her row house on Carpenter Street. The door had been replaced with something stronger and more secure. Her FBI jacket hung on the wall exactly where it had been on the night of the raid. Next to it hung a new frame containing her commendation from the Attorney General. Diane stood in her living room for a long moment, looking at the evidence of everything she had overcome. Then she pulled out her phone and dialed a familiar number. "Hey, Mama. Yeah, I'm okay. I'm coming to church on Sunday. And Mama? You can tell Mrs. Johnson that the truth always comes out. Love you too. Linda Hayes said know your place. Now she knows hers. A federal prison cell for the next 27 years. Linda Hayes said no one will believe you. Now everyone believes the truth. Linda Hayes said I run this town. Now she doesn't even run her own schedule. The woman who tried to destroy Diane Morrison had been destroyed herself. And in the end, justice had prevailed. Linda Hayes spent 18 months believing she was untouchable. She had money flowing into offshore accounts. She had a federal judge in her pocket. She had colleagues who trusted her without question and a system that protected her from scrutiny. She looked at her badge every morning and saw not a symbol of service but a shield of invincibility. She convinced herself that the rules applied to everyone except her. She told herself that she was too smart, too connected, too powerful to ever face consequences for her actions. And for 18 months, that delusion held together. But delusions always shatter eventually. The only question is how much damage they cause before they break. Linda's delusion caused immeasurable damage. It corrupted a federal judge. It endangered the careers of honest officers who trusted her. It nearly destroyed a woman whose only crime was doing her job too well. It poisoned the very institution she had sworn to serve and protect. And when the delusion finally shattered, it took everything Linda had built with it. Her career. Her freedom. Her reputation. Her future. All of it gone in a single morning because she believed she was above the law she was supposed to enforce. The abuse of power is a debt that always comes due. Sometimes the payment is delayed. Sometimes the powerful seem to escape accountability for years or even decades. But the debt never disappears. It accumulates interest. It grows heavier with every abuse, every corruption, every betrayal. And when the bill finally arrives, it arrives with a weight that crushes everything in its path. Linda Hayes thought she was building an empire. She thought every bribe she took, every favor she traded, every lie she told was adding to her power. But she was wrong. Every corrupt act was actually adding bars to her own prison cell. Every betrayal was forging another link in the chains that would eventually bind her. Every moment she spent believing she was untouchable was a moment that brought her closer to the day when she would be touched by the full weight of justice. 27 years in federal prison. That's the price Linda Hayes will pay for 18 months of believing she was above the law. That's the cost of looking at a badge and seeing protection instead of responsibility. That's what happens when power becomes an end in itself rather than a tool for serving others. Never underestimate someone based on how they look or where they come from. When those officers kicked in Diane Morrison's door at 2 in the morning, they saw a black woman in old pajamas standing in a modest row house in a working-class neighborhood. They saw what they expected to see based on an anonymous tip that confirmed their assumptions. They didn't see the 15 years of federal service. They didn't see the commendations and awards. They didn't see the steel spine that had faced down cartels and killers and emerged stronger every time. They looked at Diane Morrison and made assumptions based on her appearance, her address, her circumstances. And those assumptions nearly cost them everything. Linda Hayes made the same mistake. She looked at Diane Morrison and saw a target, someone who could be crushed without consequence. She saw a woman she could destroy with a fabricated tip and a rubber-stamped warrant. She saw what she wanted to see rather than what was actually there. And that blindness, that arrogance, that certainty that she understood her opponent, was the foundation of her downfall. Diane Morrison wasn't weak. Diane Morrison was prepared. 15 years in the FBI had taught her that documentation is protection. It had taught her to trust her instincts when something felt wrong. It had taught her that the truth, once it starts moving, becomes unstoppable. Systems can be corrupted. Institutions can be compromised. Processes can be manipulated by people who understand how to exploit their weaknesses. Linda Hayes proved that when she used the police department's own procedures as weapons against an innocent woman. She corrupted judges, manipulated evidence protocols, and exploited the trust that colleagues placed in her. For a moment, it seemed like the system itself had become an instrument of injustice rather than protection. But here's what Linda didn't understand. The truth doesn't live in systems. The truth lives in people. As long as there are people like Diane Morrison who refuse to be silenced, who document everything, who believe in justice even when the system fails them, the truth will always find its way to light. Marcus Webb could have looked away. He could have focused on saving his own career and ignored the nagging feeling that something was wrong about the raid. But he chose to listen to his instincts. He chose to meet Diane at that cafe. He chose to wear a wire and risk everything to expose the corruption that had used him as a weapon. One person's courage can crack open the truth. Two people's courage can shatter the walls that hide it. And when the truth finally emerges, no amount of corruption can put it back in the darkness. You never know who you're dealing with. That FBI jacket was hanging on Diane's wall the entire time. The commendation from the director was displayed in plain sight. All the information Linda Hayes needed to understand that she was making a catastrophic mistake was right there, visible to anyone who bothered to look. But Linda was so convinced of her own superiority, so certain that she had correctly assessed her target, that she never bothered to really see what was in front of her. She looked at Diane Morrison and saw what she wanted to see. She created a version of her target in her own mind and attacked that version instead of the real woman. And the real woman was nothing like what Linda imagined. The real woman was smarter, stronger, more resilient, and more connected than Linda could have dreamed. The real woman had allies Linda never anticipated and resources Linda never considered. The real woman turned Linda's own attack into the weapon that destroyed her. What goes around always comes around. This isn't just a saying. It's a promise. Linda Hayes said know your place to anyone she considered beneath her. Now she knows her place. A 6x8 cell in a federal prison where she'll spend the next 27 years of her life. Linda Hayes said no one will believe you to the woman she tried to destroy. Now everyone believes the truth. Every newspaper, every news channel, every court in the land believes the evidence that Diane Morrison compiled. Linda Hayes said I run this town with the arrogance of someone who thought power made her immune to consequences. Now she doesn't even run her own schedule. Every moment of her day is controlled by guards who don't care about her former status or her former connections. The words she used to intimidate others have become the epitaph of her own destruction. Every cruel phrase she spoke has been flipped and returned to her with interest. To everyone watching who has ever been underestimated, dismissed, or attacked because of how you look or where you come from, let Diane Morrison's story remind you of something important. Your power isn't determined by what others see when they look at you. Your power is determined by who you really are. The people who underestimate you are building the ladder you'll climb to reach heights they never imagined possible. The people who try to tear you down are creating the foundation of their own destruction. Stand firm in who you are. Document everything. Trust your instincts. Build your alliances. And never, ever let anyone convince you that their perception of you is more real than your knowledge of yourself. Family, I need to ask you some questions about this story. What part shocked you the most? Was it Linda Hayes' 18 months of corruption? Was it Judge O'Brien's betrayal of her oath? Was it the way the system was weaponized against an innocent woman? What would you have done in Diane Morrison's shoes? When those officers kicked in her door at 2 in the morning, she stayed calm. She raised her hand slowly. She survived the moment so she could win the war. Could you have kept that composure knowing that one wrong move could cost you your life? Do you think 27 years was enough for Linda Hayes? Some people say she deserved life in prison. Others say the public humiliation was punishment enough. What's your verdict? Tell me in the comments. And have you ever been underestimated? Have you ever been dismissed by someone who thought they knew your value just by looking at you? Share your story with this community. If this story moved you, if you felt the anger and the tension and the satisfaction when justice finally arrived, then you're part of the Black Lives Stories family. Hit that subscribe button. Turn on notifications. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Send it to someone who's been underestimated. Send it to someone fighting their own battle against people who think they're untouchable. Because here at Black Lives Stories, we believe in one thing above all else. The truth always comes to light. And when it does, the people who tried to hide it always pay the price. Until next time, family. Stay strong. Stay vigilant. And remember, you never know who's watching. You never know who's listening. And you never know when someone you underestimated is about to become your biggest regret. This is Black Lives Stories. And the story is just getting started.